The sirens were already screaming when I reached the command room. Every screen on every wall showed the same thing: a cluster of objects decelerating from somewhere beyond the orbit of Neptune, heading straight toward Earth. Now I was standing in front of a live feed from the Deep Space Array, watching 17 shapes grow larger against the black of space. My name is Nathan Cole. At the time I held the rank of commander in the United Nations Deep Space Liaison Division, a department most people did not even know existed. We had been created 5 years earlier, when the first odd signals were picked up by radio telescopes in Chile, faint patterns that could not be natural. We had debated those signals for years, argued about interference and cosmic noise and wishful thinking. The debate was now over. The objects were ships. They were enormous. The smallest of them was roughly the length of Manhattan Island, a dull silver shape that caught the distant light of the sun and threw it back in fractured patterns. They moved with a precision that made our best spacecraft look like paper airplanes caught in the wind. Nobody in the room was speaking. I could hear the hum of the climate system and the soft beeping of tracking consoles and nothing else. 23 officers stood at their stations, all of them frozen, all of them staring at displays that were rewriting every assumption humanity had ever made about its place in the universe. I remember thinking that my coffee was getting cold. Funny what your brain latches onto when the world changes forever. Within 12 hours, they had positioned themselves in a wide arc between Earth and Mars, and they had begun broadcasting a message in 7 human languages simultaneously. The translation was imperfect in places, the grammar slightly off, but the meaning was unmistakable. Every government on Earth was screaming for answers, and the only people who had any were standing in my command room, watching dots on a screen. I was part of the team that answered the broadcast. I was the one who said yes. The beings who emerged from the shuttle that landed in the Nevada desert were called the Galactic Concord. They were a federation of 42 different species from across the galaxy, united under a single governing council that had existed for longer than human civilization. Some of them walked on 2 legs, some on 4. One of them appeared to hover a few inches above the ground, though I never figured out how. Their lead representative was a tall, thin creature, with skin the color of polished copper and 6 slender fingers on each hand. Her name, as closely as human tongues could manage it, was Viellen. She moved with a careful grace that reminded me of a dancer who knew every eye in the room was on her, and she spoke English with an accent that was almost musical, rolling her vowels in a way that made every sentence sound like the beginning of a song. I liked her immediately. She had a warmth to her that felt genuine, not practiced, not diplomatic. When she shook my hand, her 6 fingers wrapped around mine with a gentleness that surprised me. That made what came next all the more difficult to accept. They had not come to share knowledge or build friendship across the stars, or welcome us into some shining galactic community. They had come because they were losing a war, and they needed soldiers. Fresh ones, expendable ones. The war had been raging for 11 centuries. 11 centuries. I asked Viellen to repeat that number, and she did, patiently, as if she understood how impossible it sounded to a species that considered a 100-year conflict unthinkable. The Dominion expanded the way a fire expands, consuming everything in its path and leaving nothing behind that it could not use. You either joined them voluntarily and surrendered your sovereignty, your culture, your right to say no, or they took everything by force. The Concord had been holding them back for over 1,000 years, but the front lines were crumbling. And now, Sitting in a conference room in the middle of the Nevada desert with a glass of water she never touched, Viellen told us that humanity occupied a region of space that was strategically critical. Our solar system sat at the junction of three major faster-than-light transit corridors. Whoever held this area could control the movement of fleets across an entire quadrant of the galaxy. She brought up holographic maps that floated above the conference table, showing lines of light crisscrossing the darkness like veins in a living body, and right there at the intersection of three of the brightest lines was a tiny yellow dot. Our sun, our home. She spoke about it the way a chess player talks about the center of the board. Necessary, valuable, worth fighting for. I asked her if worth fighting for meant worth dying for. She met my eyes, held them for a long moment, and said nothing. That silence answered better than any words could have. I spent the next 2 weeks aboard one of their cruisers. The air tasted strange up there, too sweet, like someone had dissolved candy into the oxygen supply. The gravity was slightly off, about 8% lighter than Earth normal, which made every step feel like the beginning of a jump I had not committed to. Everything felt like a dream I could not quite wake up from. The crew regarded us with a mixture of curiosity and something I eventually recognized as pity. We were the new recruits, the young ones. The species barely out of its own solar system being sized up for a uniform it had not asked to wear. They showed us their weapons systems, massive energy arrays that could crack a moon in half. They showed us their fleet formations, thousands of ships moving in patterns that had been perfected over centuries of continuous warfare. They showed us battle records stretching back to an era when humans were still learning to forge bronze, ships the size of small moons tearing each other apart in the void, worlds burning. The scale was beyond anything I had been prepared for. And they showed us the Dominion. The footage was the kind of thing that stayed with you long after you closed the file. Worlds stripped bare of resources, their surfaces scarred by industrial extraction so thorough that nothing remained but dust. Populations relocated to labor compounds that stretched across entire continents. Billions of beings forced into service for an empire they had never asked to be part of. Species that had existed for millions of years, reduced to footnotes in a Dominion archive, their languages forbidden, their histories rewritten, their children raised to serve masters they were taught to worship. But the more I watched, the more something bothered me. A pattern in the data that did not quite fit the narrative the Concorde was presenting. Inconsistencies in the timeline, gaps in the records that seemed deliberate. I asked to see the Concorde's own records, their own history with the species they called protectorates. Viellen hesitated. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. The truth was ugly on both sides. The Concorde wrapped it in prettier language, softer terminology, more elegant justifications, but the structure was the same. Lesser species were absorbed into the Federation. Their resources were redirected to serve Concorde interests. Their autonomy was limited to decisions that did not conflict with Federation policy. They were allowed to keep their cultures, their languages, their traditions, as long as none of those traditions included saying no to the Council. The Concorde called it guidance and protection. The Dominion called it order and progress. From where I stood, neither word meant freedom. I compiled my findings into a report that ran to 400 pages and sent it to every member of the UN Security Council, every head of state, every military commander with the clearance to read it. I included my recommendation on the cover page. Do not join this war. The debate lasted 3 days. It was the most heated diplomatic event in modern history. Nations that had not agreed on anything in decades suddenly found common ground in this one thing. Representatives from countries that were technically still in conflict with each other stood up and made the same argument in different languages. This was not our fight. Both sides were built on the absorption of weaker peoples. Neither side deserved our blood. The vote was 194 against military involvement, 3 abstentions, 0 in favor. Earth would not fight in someone else's war. We offered humanitarian aid. We offered medical technology that could heal wounds the Concorde's own medicine could not touch. We offered refugee resettlement for displaced populations from either side. We offered trade agreements that would benefit everyone involved. We offered everything except the one thing they actually wanted. Our soldiers. Our willingness to fight and bleed for a cause that was not ours. I was the one who delivered the decision to Viellen. We stood in a corridor of her ship, a long hallway lined with windows that looked out onto the stars. The light from a distant nebula painted everything in shades of blue and purple. She did not try to change my mind, or appeal to my emotions, or make promises she could not keep. She simply stood there, completely still, her copper skin reflecting the starlight, and when I finished speaking, she said something I have never forgotten. Not angry, not sad, bewildered, as if the universe had done something she had not thought possible. I told her that humanity had a long history of refusing things. She almost smiled at that. Almost. Then the smile faded, and she leaned closer, and her voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. She said, "Neutrality is a privilege that the Concord can respect. We understand the desire to stand apart. But the Dominion does not recognize such concepts, Commander Cole. They see only two categories of species: useful or in the way. You have declared yourselves neither useful nor willing to step aside. That leaves only one possibility in their eyes." She told me to prepare for the day when the Dominion came calling. She told me that when they did, they would not bring a trade agreement. They would bring the same thing they had brought to every species that had tried to stand alone. She said the word quietly: annihilation. Then she stepped back, straightened to her full height, and wished me well with a formality that felt like a goodbye. The ships folded space around themselves and vanished one by one, each departure marked by a brief flash of light and a ripple that our instruments could detect but not explain. When the last ship was gone, there was nothing left but empty space and a faint shimmer that faded within seconds. Below me, Earth was celebrating. Headlines declared independence from alien wars. Politicians gave speeches about sovereignty and self-determination. People threw parties in the streets of 100 cities. I did not celebrate. I went back to my office, closed the door, pulled up every file the Concord had shared about the Terrassi Dominion, and began reading. I read for 14 hours straight, through the night and into the morning, fueled by cold coffee and a growing certainty that the celebration below me was premature. By the time I finished, I understood exactly what Viellen had been afraid of. Not afraid for herself. Not afraid of humanity. Afraid for us. I started writing contingency plans that night. Nobody asked me to. Nobody wanted to hear about them. But I wrote them anyway, because I had seen the look in Viellen's eyes, and I knew that sooner or later, the Dominion would arrive at our door. The only question was when, and whether we would be ready when they did. For the first 3 years after the Concorde departed, nothing happened. Earth carried on as it always had, arguing about borders and budgets, and which nation deserved a permanent seat on whatever new council was being formed that month. The alien visit became old news faster than anyone could have predicted. Conspiracy theories replaced actual analysis. People debated whether the whole thing had been staged by governments looking for an excuse to increase defense spending. Talk show hosts made jokes about it. Children dressed as aliens for costume parties. The reality of what had happened, the fact that we had been visited by a civilization fighting a war that had lasted longer than human recorded history, and had been asked to join that fight, faded into background noise. I kept my head down at Deep Space Command and continued building defensive proposals that nobody read, filing them in a classified archive that gathered digital dust. Then, on a Tuesday morning in March, a Terrassi Dominion trade vessel appeared at the edge of our solar system and requested permission to dock. They did not ask to speak with our leaders. They did not ask about our military capabilities or our political structure. They asked to speak with our merchants. That was how the Golden Age began. The Dominion wanted raw materials. Earth had them in abundance: rare earth metals, industrial alloys, certain biological compounds that were apparently unique to our biosphere, proteins that could not be synthesized anywhere else, mineral compositions that existed on no other world in their vast territory. In exchange, they offered technology, not weapons, nothing that would raise alarms in the intelligence community, manufacturing techniques that could triple our industrial output overnight, energy systems that made nuclear fusion look like striking a match, medical advances that could extend human life by decades, eradicate diseases that had tormented us for centuries, and repair injuries that would have been permanent under human medicine. The deals were staggeringly profitable. Within a year, Earth's economy had been transformed beyond recognition. Poverty rates plummeted across every nation. Life expectancy soared. Industries that had taken generations to build were rendered obsolete overnight, replaced by new ones that ran on principles we were only beginning to understand. The world was getting richer, healthier, and more capable at a pace that would have seemed like fantasy 5 years earlier. Within 3 years, human colonies had expanded from 4 modest outposts to 14 thriving worlds, spread across nearby star systems using adapted versions of Dominion transit drives. Engineers who had spent their careers dreaming about reaching the nearest star were now commuting between solar systems the way previous generations had commuted between cities. The population across all human settlements crossed 12 billion. We were building things, growing things, discovering things. We were drunk on our own success, so intoxicated by the pace of progress that we forgot to ask the most obvious question: why was the Dominion being so generous to a species that had publicly refused to fight on their behalf? I sat in my office at Deep Space Command, watching the trade data scroll across my screens, the numbers climbing higher every quarter, and I waited for the answer to that question. I was certain I would not like it. The answer arrived in the form of a being called Calith. He came without warning, aboard a warship that was 4 times the size of anything in Earth's fleet, a vessel so enormous that it cast a visible shadow on the surface of the moon as it passed overhead. He announced himself as a war prince of the Terrassi Dominion, third in the line of military succession, commander of 14 battle groups, and conqueror of 91 worlds. He listed each of those 91 worlds by name, slowly, as if he wanted to make sure we had time to count them. Unlike the Concord's diplomats, who had been careful and measured and conscious of every impression they made, Caliph was blunt. He was tall even by Dominion standards, broad and heavy, with a frame covered in interlocking plates of natural armor that shifted color when he moved, rippling from dark blue to deep green, like oil on water. His eyes were the deep orange of a setting sun, and they never blinked, not once. In any of our meetings, he requested a meeting with me specifically, by name, and I had no idea how he even knew who I was. It turned out he had been studying us for far longer than we had realized. We met in a conference room at the orbital station above Earth. Lucy Harmon, our chief xenolinguist and one of the finest analytical minds I have ever worked alongside, sat beside me with a tablet on which she recorded every word. Peter Langley from Military Intelligence was monitoring from the next room, recording everything through sensors embedded in the walls, ready to pull the alarm if anything went wrong. Caliph walked in, ducking slightly under the doorframe, sat down across from us in a chair that groaned under his weight, and spent the first 20 minutes asking questions about human history. Not our technology, not our fleet strength, not our economic output or our political positions, or our trade capacity. He wanted to know about our wars. All of them. He asked about the campaigns of ancient empires, the strategies of commanders whose names most people had forgotten centuries ago. He asked about the trench warfare of the early 20th century, with a level of detail that suggested he had read primary sources. He asked about the nuclear standoffs of the Cold War, the guerrilla conflicts that had burned across every continent, the civil wars that had torn nations apart from the inside. He knew more about our past than most humans did. He quoted dates and casualty figures with the casual precision of someone reciting breakfast orders. When I asked him why he was so interested, he tilted his head in a way that I later learned was the Dominion equivalent of a smile, and he said words that I have turned over in my mind 1,000 times since. Every other civilization we have encountered fights when survival demands it. They fight to protect their territory, their offspring, their resources. It is a reaction to threat. Your kind fights because it cannot help itself. You wage war over ideas, over pride, over lines drawn on maps that have no physical reality. You develop weapons capable of ending your own species, and then point them at each other, and wait to see who flinches first. I have studied 47 civilizations in my career, Commander Cole. None of them do what you do. I find it deeply fascinating, and deeply useful. The way he said useful sent a current through the room. Lucy gripped my arm under the table. Her fingernails dug into my skin hard enough to leave marks that I noticed later. I kept my face neutral, the way Peter had trained me, giving nothing away, showing nothing. I asked Caliph directly what he wanted from Earth. He said he wanted nothing. Yet. He said the word yet the way someone sets a weapon on the table between you. Slowly, deliberately, making sure you see it and understand what it means. Then he stood, thanked us for our time with an elaborate courtesy that felt like a performance, and departed. His shuttle rose from the docking bay, and his warship folded space and vanished. Peter came into the room after the last sensor trace faded. His face was pale, and Peter Langley was not a man who turned pale easily. He had been running counterintelligence for 12 years, and had seen things that would keep most people awake for the rest of their lives. He told me something that made the room feel smaller. The Dominion had been running intelligence operations in our solar system for at least 2 years. Surveillance satellites hidden in the asteroid belt, devices so small and so well camouflaged that our sensors had classified them as natural rock. Signal intercepts on our military communications, our government channels, our civilian networks. They had been listening to everything. Every strategy meeting, every classified briefing, every private conversation that passed through an electronic signal. The entire time we thought we were the ones keeping an eye on them, they had been studying us the way a predator studies something it has not yet decided whether to eat. He would meet with trade officials, negotiate deals that were always slightly more generous than they needed to be, sweetening terms in ways that seemed charitable but felt like bait, and then he would request a private meeting with me. During these meetings, he never threatened, he never demanded. He never raised his voice, or issued ultimatums, or dropped the mask of courteous interest. He simply talked, and I listened, and each conversation left me more certain that the Dominion viewed Earth the way a farmer views a field. Something to be tended, something to be allowed to grow, until it was time to collect what had been planted. Meanwhile, the attacks began. Human trade convoys operating near the outer colonies started disappearing. Not in dramatic confrontations, not in battles that made headlines. They simply vanished. Cargo vessels with crews of 20 or 30 people would set out on routine runs through well-mapped transit corridors and never arrive. Search parties found debris fields where the ships should have been, fragments of hull plating tumbling through the void, frozen cargo containers split open and drifting, and sometimes personal belongings that had survived the destruction. A child's drawing, still sealed in a protective frame, a locket with a photograph inside, a pair of work boots spinning slowly in zero gravity, as if their owner had simply stepped out of them and floated away. The wreckage showed signs of weapons fire that matched no known human technology, but bore unmistakable similarities to Dominion energy signatures. The Dominion expressed deep concern and promised thorough investigation. Nothing changed. The attacks continued. always small enough to be dismissed as pirate activity, always frequent enough to remind us that the space beyond our borders was not as safe as we had convinced ourselves it was. What the Dominion did not know, what nobody outside a very small and very carefully selected circle knew, was that we had not been idle behind our smiling trade delegations and our diplomatic protests. A project had been running in absolute secrecy for 4 years. We called it Project Aegis. Helen Cross from Military Intelligence had conceived it during a sleepless night after the first convoy disappeared, sketching the framework on a napkin in a mess hall at 3 in the morning. I had championed it through 6 rounds of funding battles, arguing with politicians who thought I was paranoid, and bureaucrats who thought I was throwing money at shadows. Philip Morton, the most brilliant engineer I have ever known, a quiet man with ink-stained fingers and wire-rimmed glasses, who rarely spoke more than 3 sentences at a time, but whose sentences were worth more than most people's speeches, had built it. Every piece of alien technology that flowed into Earth through the trade deals was quietly duplicated, not just copied, studied at the molecular level, taken apart, understood, and then rebuilt better than the original. Our scientists did not simply learn how to replicate what the aliens had given us. They figured out why it worked, identified the inefficiencies that the Dominion and the Concorde had never bothered to fix, because their technology was already good enough for their purposes, and made it better, faster, more powerful, more precise. We built weapon systems that neither the Concorde nor the Dominion knew existed. Weapons that used their own principles against them in ways they had never imagined. We constructed a defense network that could activate in 90 seconds, and blanket every inhabited human world with a detection and response grid so sensitive it could track a single ship across half a light year. And we did all of it in facilities buried deep underground, shielded from the surveillance satellites that Peter Langley's team had identified, mapped, and deliberately left in place. "Let them watch," Peter said, with a smile that had no warmth in it. "Let them see exactly what we want them to see. Let them think we are fat and happy and soft." I should have felt safe. I should have trusted the preparations. But I could not shake the feeling that we were running out of time, that the harvest Caliph kept hinting at with his careful words and his unblinking eyes was closer than anyone wanted to admit. That feeling became a certainty the day I visited Elysium. Elysium was humanity's most distant colony, a garden world orbiting a yellow star 47 light-years from Earth. It was beautiful in a way that photographs could not capture, the kind of beauty you had to stand inside to understand. Rolling green hills that stretched to every horizon without a single fence or wall. Rivers so clear you could count the stones on the bottom from 20 feet up. The water tasting clean and cold and alive. Forests of trees that were not quite like anything on Earth but close enough to feel familiar. Their leaves a shade of green that seemed deeper, richer, as if the color itself had more depth here. And a sky that turned 7 different colors at sunset, layering gold over rose over violet, over shades that did not have names in any human language, as if the atmosphere were performing a symphony every evening that nobody had to buy tickets to see. 2.3 million people lived there. Families who had sold everything they owned for a one-way ticket, farmers who grew crops in soil that had never known a single drop of pesticide, teachers who ran schools where children learned about Earth the way children on Earth learned about ancient Rome, as a fascinating origin story for a civilization that had moved on. It was the kind of place people went when they wanted room to breathe, when they wanted to give their children a sky big enough to hold all their dreams. I spent 3 days inspecting the colony's defenses, which was a generous word for what they had. 4 patrol ships, civilian models with weapon mounts, that had been bolted on as an afterthought. A ground-based sensor array that was 12 years out of date, and could detect an incoming vessel at a range of about 2 light minutes, which meant that by the time it saw a threat coming, the threat would already be close enough to wave at. I wrote a scathing assessment and filed it with command. On my second evening, after a long day of arguments with administrators, who assured me with the confident smiles of people who had never been in danger that Elysium was perfectly safe, I walked through the central market in the colony's main settlement. The air smelled like fresh bread and rain, and something sweet that I learned was a native flower that bloomed at dusk, opening pale petals to the cooling air. People were laughing, musicians were playing on a corner, something with strings and a rhythm that made you want to slow down and listen. A couple was dancing in the space between stalls, and nobody thought it was strange. Nobody was in a hurry. Nobody was looking over their shoulder. A girl behind a fruit stall, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with brown hair pulled into a messy ponytail and a gap-toothed grin that took up half her face, waved me over and asked if I wanted to try a star fruit. She told me her mother had planted the tree that grew them, 3 years ago, the same year they had arrived from a city on Earth whose name I do not remember. She said the tree had almost died the first winter, but her mother had wrapped it in blankets and talked to it every morning, and now it produced more fruit than they could sell. She asked where I was from. I told her Earth. Her eyes went wide, the way children's eyes do when you tell them something that makes the world seem bigger than they thought. She asked if it was true that aliens were real. I said yes. She leaned forward, her elbows on the stall, her chin in her hands, and she asked if they were friendly. I looked at her face, open and trusting, and full of the kind of hope that only children carry, the kind that has not yet learned to protect itself, that gives itself freely to anyone willing to take it. And I told her yes. I lied right to her face, because the truth would have put fear in those eyes, and I could not do that to her. Not in that market. Not on that evening. Not under that sky that was beginning its 7-color performance overhead. Her name was Grace Bennett. I wish I did not know that. I wish I could forget her face. I have tried. I cannot. When I returned to Earth, I submitted a formal request for a permanent fleet deployment to Elysium. 40 warships, minimum. A full orbital defense platform. The cost was deemed excessive, the strategic value of Elysium classified as low, the risk assessment concluding that the Dominion had no reason to target a civilian colony with no military significance. I argued. I pushed. I went above my chain of command and appealed directly to the Secretary General's office. The answer did not change. Too expensive, too provocative, too unlikely. 3 months later, I received a classified intelligence briefing that turned the cold feeling in my stomach into something closer to certainty. The Dominion's war with the Concord had reached a critical turning point. The Concord had launched a massive offensive on 4 fronts simultaneously, committing reserves they had been holding back for centuries. For the first time in living memory, the Dominion was losing ground. Their supply lines were stretched thin, their fleet reserves were depleted, their protectorate species were growing restless, sensing weakness in masters who had seemed invincible for 6,000 years. Peter Langley sat in the corner of my office and watched me read the report without saying a word. He did not need to say what we were both thinking. Desperate empires do desperate things. Cornered animals do not negotiate. They lash out at the nearest target, not the most strategic one. I submitted another request for Elysium's defense that same afternoon. It was denied again. I was told to stop being alarmist. I remember the exact moment it happened. Not the date, though I know that too. I know the day, and the hour, and the minute, and the precise position of the second hand on the clock, when my life divided into before and after. I was in the command center at Deep Space Command, reviewing fleet deployments on the main display, making minor adjustments to patrol routes for the outer colonies. Routine work that occupied my hands while my mind ran through scenarios I hoped would never play out. The room was quiet. Routine. Helen Cross was at her station running signal analysis. Peter Langley was in his office next door, probably reading an intelligence report with a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. The clock on the wall read 14 minutes past 2 in the afternoon. Then Helen's voice cut through the room. "Commander Cole, we have contacts emerging from faster-than-light transit over Elysium. Multiple contacts." She paused. Her fingers moved across her console. The color left her face in stages, like water draining from a glass. When she spoke again, her voice cracked on the first word. "It is the 9th Annihilation Fleet." The 9th was the Dominion's most feared battle group. Over 300 warships, each one designed and built for a single purpose. Not conquest, not occupation, not negotiation or demonstration of force. The 9th Fleet did not negotiate. It did not accept surrender. It did not distinguish between military installations and schoolyards. Its name was its mission statement. I gave the order to open a channel to Elysium's planetary defense coordinator. His name was George Palmer. I had known him for 15 years. He had been at my wedding. He had a daughter named Sarah who played piano, with a talent that made professional musicians stop and listen. The channel connected after a delay that lasted approximately 4 seconds and felt like 4 years. And I heard his voice, steady and calm and layered underneath, with the kind of understanding that comes when a man looks out his window and sees the end of everything he has built. "Nathan, they are everywhere. I can see them from the window of my office. The sky is full of them." I asked him about the defense grid. He made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob, and was neither. Four patrol ships, with bolted-on weapons against 300 warships, designed to end worlds. He told me he was ordering an evacuation. I did not tell him what we both already knew. There was nowhere to evacuate to. The 9th Fleet had already positioned ships at every transit point in the system. No ship was getting in. No ship was getting out. The cage was closed. The attack lasted 19 minutes. 19 minutes. I have tried to convey what that number means. 19 minutes is the time it takes to drive to the grocery store and back, to take a shower, to watch the opening of a film, In 19 minutes, the Dominion erased a civilization of 2.3 million human beings from existence, and did it with the efficiency of someone clearing a spreadsheet. I stood in the command center and watched it happen on the sensor displays. Helen Cross called out readings in a voice that grew steadily quieter as the numbers grew steadily worse. The Dominion fleet positioned itself in a standard orbital bombardment pattern, forming a sphere around Elysium that left no gap, no blind spot, no angle that was not covered by their weapons. Then they began firing. I watched the surface temperature readings spike across the board, continent by continent, region by region. I watched atmospheric composition destabilize as the planet's air itself caught fire. I watched communication channels fill with voices, so many voices, people screaming, children crying, parents calling out names, someone praying in a language I did not recognize, a woman singing to a baby, her voice steady and deliberate, as if she had decided that the last thing her child would hear would be a song. Then, sector by sector, the voices stopped. The channels went to static. One by one, like candles being blown out in a dark hallway, the signals from Elysium's cities and towns and farms and schools went dark. The thermal readings leveled off at temperatures that could not support life, could not support anything. The oceans boiled, the atmosphere burned. Everything that had been green and alive and filled with people and laughter and music and a girl selling starfruit with a gap-toothed grin was gone. George Palmer's channel was the last to go silent. He did not say goodbye. He did not curse the Dominion or rage against the unfairness of it. He said, "Tell my daughter I am sorry I could not come home." Then there was static. Then there was nothing. I did not cry. Changed. Like a door closing on a room I would never enter again, sealing it shut with everything warm and uncertain and human on the other side. What replaced it was cold. Perfectly, absolutely cold. Like a machine switching on inside my chest. Precise and tireless, and aimed at a single purpose that I could feel but not yet name. Helen Cross was crying at her station, tears running down her face while her hands continued moving across her console, still recording data, still doing her job, because it was the only thread keeping her from falling apart. Half the command center was crying. Officers who had served in difficult situations, who had seen terrible things, were standing at their posts with wet faces and clenched fists and red eyes. I could not cry. The cold thing would not allow it. The emergency session of the United Nations General Assembly convened within 6 hours. I watched the feed from my office because I could not be in a room with that many people. The footage from Elysium played on every screen. The thermal readings climbing past survivable thresholds. The audio from the communication channels. Voices layered over voices. A chorus of 2.3 million people learning in real time that the universe was not what they had believed it to be. I watched the faces of politicians and diplomats and heads of state who had spent their entire careers in disagreement, representatives of nations that had been adversaries for generations. And I watched them listen to those recordings, and I watched the same thing happen to every single one of them. The same change, the same door closing, the same cold thing settling into place behind their eyes. The vote for war was unanimous. Not a single dissent, not a single abstention, not a single request for more time or more debate. 212 nations spoke as one. The Dominion had expected the attack to break us. Their logic was sound by their standards. In every previous case throughout 6,000 years of expansion, when the Dominion had destroyed a colony belonging to a lesser species, that species had submitted within days. Fear was the most effective weapon in the Dominion's arsenal. Show a species what you are capable of, what you are willing to do, and they will do anything to make sure you never do it again. The weapon had never failed. War Prince Calith sent a message within hours. His tone was calm, almost warm. He expressed regret for the loss of life. He called it unfortunate, but necessary. He said the Dominion still valued humanity. He offered us one final chance to join, contribute soldiers, and receive protection. He expected grief. He expected panic. He expected us to behave the way every other species had behaved when the Dominion showed them the cost of standing alone. Earth's response was 7 words long. We broadcasted on every frequency, in every known alien language, across every channel our technology could reach. We are coming for you all. I signed the war declaration that afternoon. My hand was steady. The cold thing held it steady. That frightened me more than anything the Dominion had ever done. Ambassador Viellen contacted us within the hour. She appeared on screen, looking older than I remembered, exhausted in a way that went deeper than the physical. She offered alliance, ships, intelligence, supply lines. The color left her face. She had spent years trying to get humanity to join her war, and now that we had joined, she was looking at something in my eyes that terrified her. She should have been terrified. The mobilization was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Within 48 hours, every shipyard, every factory, every research facility on Earth, and across the colonies, had pivoted to a single purpose. Philip Morton, who had built Project Aegis in secrecy with a fraction of the resources he needed, now had the industrial might of an entire species behind him. We did in 90 days what the Concord's military analysts said would take 10 years. They did not understand us. They measured us by every other species they had encountered. Those species had not spent their entire existence in an arms race against themselves. Every war humanity had ever fought, every conflict, every desperate innovation born from the need to survive against impossible odds, had been practice. Kaelith had been right about that. We were a species that fought itself for practice. And now we had a real enemy. I took command of the expeditionary fleet standing on the bridge of a carrier that had not existed 4 months earlier. Lucy Harmon beside me. Peter Langley, running covert operations. Helen Cross on communications and sensors. Edward Shaw commanding the strike groups, Catherine Wells managing what little diplomacy remained. I looked at the fleet assembled around us. 230 warships, 60,000 autonomous drones, 400,000 men and women who had volunteered knowing what they were flying into. None of them hesitated. I gave the order. Every military doctrine assumed a new combatant would secure its own borders first, build defensive positions, consolidate before attacking. We did none of that. On the same night our main fleet departed Earth, 36 small teams in unremarkable cargo shuttles crossed into Dominion territory undetected. Engineers, hackers, demolition specialists. In a single coordinated operation, they disabled 16 critical supply depots across 4 sectors. The Dominion's war machine, which had been feeding its fleets from those depots for centuries, suddenly found itself starving. Kyleth redeployed 3 battle groups to hunt the sabotage teams. This was what we wanted. While his ships chased ghosts through their own territory, burning fuel and time searching for people who had already vanished back into civilian shipping lanes, wearing borrowed identities, our main fleet hit the gaps they left behind. Edward Shaw led the first major engagement at a system the Dominion called Verith, a heavily fortified border outpost that had repelled Concord assaults for 300 years. He brought 60 ships against a garrison of 90. By every model the Dominion had built over 6,000 years of warfare, he should have lost. The garrison commander deployed his fleet in the standard intercept formation, the same arrangement that had won 10,000 previous engagements, and waited for Shaw to come to him. Shaw did not come. Our ships dropped out of transit at extreme range, far beyond the effective distance of the garrison's weapons, and deployed drone swarms. Millions of tiny autonomous units, each one smaller than a dinner plate, powered by miniaturized reactors based on Dominion technology that Philip Morton's team had improved by a factor of 12. The garrison's weapons were designed to track and destroy capital ships, objects hundreds of meters long. They could hit a cruiser at half a light second with devastating accuracy. They could not track 10 million independent units moving at different speeds in different directions, with no formation, no pattern, no predictable behavior. The drones moved the way a swarm of insects moves, each one making decisions based on local conditions, the collective acting without a central command that could be disrupted. They overwhelmed the point defenses in the first hour, attached to hull plating in the second, and spent the third and fourth cutting through armor with focused energy beams thinner than a human hair. The garrison fell in 4 hours. Shaw did not lose a single ship. The Concorde had been trying to take Verith for 3 centuries. We took it in an afternoon. News of Verith spread through the galaxy faster than any fleet could travel. A young species had dismantled a fortress the galaxy had considered untouchable, using a method of warfare nobody had ever seen. The Dominion had never encountered asymmetric tactics. Their entire philosophy was built on the assumption that bigger meant stronger, that more ships and more firepower always won. Their doctrine had no chapter on enemies that refused to meet them on equal terms. Shaw did not pause after Verith. He pushed deeper, hitting garrison after garrison. At Peleron, he used a captured communication relay to broadcast false fleet movement orders, sending 3 Dominion battle groups racing toward a phantom threat, while he slipped past and took their supply station uncontested. At the Kestrin Nebula, he exploited dense gas clouds the Dominion considered impassable by sending drones through in waves, the units too small for the nebula's interference to disable. Each engagement taught us something new, and each lesson was fed back into our database and distributed to every ship within hours. We were learning faster than they could adapt, evolving inside their decision cycle, changing our approach before they developed a counter. While Shaw dismantled their borders, Helen Cross launched a second front that carried no weapons at all. For 2 years, she had been compiling intercepted Dominion communications, sifting through encrypted files with an archaeologist's patience. Among those files were classified records of what the Dominion had done to its own subject species over 6 millennia. Forced relocations displacing billions, resource seizures that stripped worlds to bedrock, cultural programs designed to erase languages, religions, histories, replacing them with Dominion-approved substitutes, breeding programs that selected for obedience, things buried so deep most Dominion citizens had never heard of them. No commentary, no framing, just raw data in the Dominion's own format, with their own authentication stamps. The truth did the work. On Varric, workers in the Dominion's largest orbital shipyard walked off the job and refused to return, halting production of 17 warships. We gave them the crack. 3 months into the campaign, Word reached me that the Ninth Annihilation Fleet had been pulled from the Concord front and redirected to Korath's Gate, a narrow transit corridor connecting the outer territories to the Dominion's core worlds. If the Dominion held the gate, they could funnel reinforcements to their crumbling garrisons. But the strategic calculation was not what drove my decision. It was the designation. The Ninth. The fleet that burned Elysium. The fleet whose commander had ordered the bombardment that erased Grace Bennett's world. I told Shaw to continue the border campaign. Using Dominion transit interdiction technology they had fundamentally reimagined, they had constructed a gravity trap, 64 generators positioned at precise coordinates throughout the system that, when activated simultaneously, would collapse the local transit corridors and seal the system shut. Any ship inside would not be able to leave until the generators were deactivated, including ours. Peter asked me if I was sure. I told him I was. Lucy asked what I would do if the battle turned against us. I told her it would not turn against us. She asked how I knew. I said because I had been preparing for this since the day Elysium's readings went flat, and I had not thought about anything else since. The Ninth arrived in force. 312 warships spreading across the system in a combat formation refined over centuries. The moment their fleet fully materialized, every ship accounted for, I gave the activation order. The gravity generators fired. The transit corridors collapsed. And 312 Dominion warships found themselves locked in a cage with a species that had been waiting for them. The battle lasted 9 hours. It was methodical, systematic. Everything humanity had learned across 10,000 years of fighting itself, refined and focused and aimed at a single enemy. Our drones swarmed their flanks in adaptive waves. Our electronic warfare blinded their sensors and fed their targeting computers false data, turning automated defense systems against neighboring ships. Our strike groups hit weak points that Helen Cross's analysis had identified months in advance, structural vulnerabilities the Dominion had never fixed because no enemy had been creative enough to exploit them. The Dominion fought back with the desperate intensity of cornered predators. They were not cowards. They were simply facing something they had never been built to fight. I stood on the bridge through all 9 hours and directed the operation with the cold thing steady in my chest, keeping my voice calm, my orders precise, my mind running calculations I fed to Lucy, who turned them into tactical adjustments she relayed to Shaw, who executed them with the timing of a man who had rehearsed this moment every sleepless night since Elysium. When the last Dominion ship went dark, nobody spoke. Nobody cheered. We sat among the wreckage of 312 warships, and the silence was total. In his last entry, written as his ship came apart, he recorded that he did not understand what was happening. Every protocol followed, every countermeasure deployed, none of it effective. He wrote that fighting humans was like fighting water. You could strike it, and it flowed around your fist and came at you from every direction you were not guarding. He wrote that his species had made a fundamental error. They had studied human history and concluded that humans were good at fighting. They had not understood the real truth. Humans were good at winning. The fall of the Ninth changed the war in ways beyond the military. The Dominion's empire rested not on territory or resources, but on the belief that they could not be beaten. In 9 hours, that belief shattered. Species across their space saw the reports and drew their own conclusions. If the Ninth could fall, anything could. You are fighting your own, and yours is more frightening than anything we imagined. She said that the Concord had fought for 11 centuries, using honor and formation warfare. We were not fighting to help the Concord maintain their position. We were fighting because 2.3 million of our people had been erased, and the cold thing in every human chest that had formed on that day would not allow us to stop until the species responsible could never do it again. That kind of purpose does not negotiate. It does not slow down. Protectorate rebellions, fueled by our intelligence releases, and by visible proof that the Dominion was no longer invincible, spread to over 20 worlds. Entire sectors fell, not because we conquered them, but because subject populations rose up and did it themselves. We gave them the opening. They did the rest. The Dominion tried to negotiate 3 times. The first was an armistice with territorial concessions. The second was full withdrawal from contested space. The third was a desperate plea for any terms at all. Each time I read the proposal, deleted it, and ordered the next advance. 14 months after the declaration of war, our fleet arrived at Tyrosar Prime, the Dominion homeworld. I had studied it in intelligence files for years, read descriptions, reviewed sensor data, memorized its orbital parameters. None of that prepared me for seeing it. The planet was nearly twice the size of Earth, a massive world with black oceans that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, giving them the appearance of vast pools of ink, stretching between continents of dark stone. Iron citadels rose from the surface like the teeth of some enormous creature, towers and spires built over thousands of years, each one a monument to the Dominion's belief in its own permanence. Even from orbit, you could feel the age of the place, the weight of 6,000 years of unbroken rule pressing down on everything beneath those towers. Over 40 billion beings lived there, generations upon generations who had been born into the certainty that their empire would last forever, that the natural order of the galaxy placed them at the top, and that nothing could change that fundamental truth. I stood at the viewport of my flagship and looked down at that world and felt the cold thing in my chest pulse harder than it ever had. A deep, steady rhythm, like a second heartbeat synchronized to something that was not quite anger, and not quite satisfaction, and not quite hunger, but contained elements of all 3. Part of me wanted to end it the way they had ended Elysium. Part of me wanted to give the order, and watch their world burn the way Grace Bennett's world had burned. To stand at my console, and observe the temperature readings climb, and the atmospheric composition destabilize, and know that the equation had been balanced, the debt repaid, in the only currency the Dominion had ever understood. That part of me was strong. It had been growing for 14 months, fed by every engagement, every Dominion fleet reduced to wreckage, every mile of territory gained. It whispered in a voice that sounded like my own, that this was justice, that this was what the 2.3 million demanded, that Grace Bennett and George Palmer, and every name I would later read in that garden, were watching and waiting for me to finish what the Dominion had started. Unfortunate but necessary. War Prince Caliph made a final broadcast to his people from the surface of Tyrosar Prime. The transmission was raw, unpolished, nothing like the careful diplomatic communications he had sent during our previous interactions. He stood in what appeared to be a command bunker beneath one of the iron citadels, his armor scarred and darkened from damage that had not been repaired, his eyes burning with the last of their orange fire. He called humanity a plague upon the galaxy. He said we were destroyers of civilizations, predators that the universe had not been prepared for, a species that had been allowed to grow unchecked until it consumed everything around it. He told his people to fight to the last breath, to the last weapon, to the last child old enough to hold a weapon, because surrender would mean the end of everything the Dominion had built across 6,000 years of expansion. I sat in my command chair and listened to every word, and I felt the cold thing pulse with each sentence. And I realized two things that sat heavier than anything I had carried through 14 months of war. The first was that Caleth was not entirely wrong. We had become something fearsome, something that our own allies watched with barely concealed anxiety, something that had turned all of humanity's creativity and adaptability and stubborn refusal to accept defeat into a machine for systematic destruction, and that machine had been devastatingly effective. The second thing was that, if I gave the order to destroy Tyrosar Prime, Caleth would be completely right. Every word he had said about us would be proven true. And the girl with the gap-toothed grin would have asked her question to a species that did not deserve the trust she placed in us. The debate within Earth's leadership was the most difficult conversation I have ever been part of. It lasted 3 days. Half of the council wanted what the cold thing in my chest wanted. Complete destruction. An eye for an eye, a world for a world. They carried photographs. They read names. They played recordings from Elysium's final communications, the voices of people calling for help that would never come, and they asked how anyone could hear those voices and argue for restraint. They were not wrong to be angry. They were not wrong to want the Dominion to experience what Elysium had experienced. Their pain was real and earned, and I would never deny them the right to feel it. Helen Cross, who had cried at her station the day Elysium burned, and had not stopped working since, stood up and argued for mercy, with a steadiness that silenced the room. She said that revenge and justice were not the same thing, that they wore similar faces but led to very different places, and that the moment we confused them, we would lose something we could never recover. Peter Langley, pragmatic to the last, pointed out that destroying a planet of 40 billion would make humanity the common enemy of every species in the galaxy for the rest of time, and that the alliance we had built would collapse overnight. Edward Shaw, who had fought more Dominion engagements than anyone else in the room, said nothing. When asked for his opinion, he simply said, "I have done enough. Whatever you decide, leave me out of it." Lucy Harmon was quiet through most of the meeting, sitting in her chair with her hands folded, watching the argument pass back and forth across the table with an expression that I could not read. Then, near the end, when the room had exhausted itself, and every argument had been made, and everyone was looking at me for the final word, she looked at me and said quietly, "Nathan, you told a little girl that aliens were friendly. What are you going to tell the next little girl who asks?" The room went silent, not the silence of people waiting for someone to speak, the silence of people who had just heard the only thing that mattered. And her question, the simplest question in the universe, asked by a child who believed that the answer mattered. Are they friendly? I understood, standing in that silence, that the answer I gave now would not just define this moment, or this war, or this decision. It would define what humanity was going to be, for as long as humanity existed. A species that had been pushed to the very edge of what it could endure, and had come back with mercy in its hands. Their leadership would face tribunals for the crimes they had committed. Every subject species would be freed and given full sovereignty over their own worlds. Reparations would be assessed and paid over 500 years. Every world the Dominion had conquered would be returned to its original inhabitants. The intelligence apparatus would be dissolved. The mechanisms of control would be stripped away. But Tyrosar Prime would stand. Its cities would remain. Its people would live. Its culture would survive. Changed and diminished, but alive. I made that choice not because the Dominion deserved mercy. I am still not certain they did. I made it because we deserved to remain the kind of species that could still extend it. Because if we became what the Dominion was, then 2.3 million people had died for nothing, and Grace Bennett had given her trust to a species that had not earned the right to receive it. The surrender was signed aboard my flagship in a conference room that had been designed for tactical briefings, not diplomatic ceremonies. There were no flags, no music, no cameras broadcasting to a waiting galaxy. Just a table, 2 chairs on each side, and a document that would end 6,000 years of Dominion rule. Catherine Wells had drafted the terms over 72 sleepless hours, cross-referencing every treaty in human history and every precedent in galactic law. She sat at my right, the document in front of her, her hands perfectly steady, despite the fact that she had not slept in 3 days. Kyleth was last into the room. He walked slowly, his movements carrying none of the controlled power I remembered from our meetings years ago. His armor plates, which had once shifted through rich blues and greens, were dull and motionless, a flat gray that made him look smaller, diminished. His orange eyes were dimmed to something closer to amber, like a fire burning down to its last coals. He sat across from me, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. Not a question, not an accusation. A statement of fact, spoken by someone who had spent 14 months watching the impossible unfold and had finally accepted it. Catherine shifted in her seat. Lucy watched from the doorway. Then I said, because someone once asked me if aliens were friendly, and I want to be able to answer that question honestly someday. He studied my face with those fading eyes, searching for something I do not think he found. Then he picked up the pen, and his hand, a hand that had signed orders sending fleets to conquer 91 worlds, trembled slightly as he wrote his name. He set the pen down, pushed the document across the table, stood, and walked out of the room without looking back. The Concorde watched the proceedings with barely hidden anxiety. We had done in 14 months what they had failed to accomplish in 11 centuries of warfare, and we had done it so completely, and so quickly, that their relief at the Dominion's defeat was overwhelmed by a new and more immediate concern. What would humanity do with the power it now held? Ambassador Vielen proposed a mutual defense framework, an elaborate system of treaties, oversight councils, and shared intelligence networks that was, beneath its diplomatic language, a mechanism to monitor humanity and constrain our military capacity, without saying so directly. I agreed to participate. Vielen looked surprised. She had expected resistance. Then I added my condition, and the surprise shifted to something closer to alarm. Every species in the framework would be treated as a full equal. No more protectorates. No more subordinate partnerships. No more lesser peoples absorbed into larger ones under the pretense of guidance or protection or civilizational improvement. Every civilization, no matter how young or how small or how recently discovered, would have complete sovereignty, full representation, and the unconditional protection of the collective. Vielen tried to negotiate. She offered modifications, compromises, phased implementations. I told her there was nothing to negotiate. She looked past me at the fleet visible through the viewport, counted the ships that had dismantled the Dominion in barely over a year, and agreed. We built a memorial on Elysium. Not a monument, not a tower or a wall or anything made of stone or metal. Catherine Wells suggested a garden, and the moment she said it, the rightness of it settled over me like a hand on my shoulder. Across the scarred and blackened surface of the world the Dominion had burned, we brought soil from Earth. Rich, dark Earth from every continent, carried in sealed containers across 47 light-years. We brought seeds from every colony, from every world where humans had planted roots and watched things grow. Flowering plants from New Geneva, fruit trees from the orchards of Corin 4, wild grasses from the plains of Haven. Catherine spent 8 months selecting every species, testing each one for its ability to take root in damaged ground, to grow in soil that had been burned and poisoned and left for dead. She chose plants that were resilient, stubborn, the kind that pushed through cracks in concrete and sent roots into places that seemed inhospitable. She said that was the point. Life does not ask permission to return. It simply returns. When the garden was finished, it covered 100 square miles of what had once been ash and silence. Green where there had been black, color where there had been nothing. The wind carried the scent of growing things across a world that the Dominion had tried to turn into a graveyard. During the dedication ceremony, with representatives from every known species in the galaxy standing in the sunlight among plants that should not have been possible on a world that should not have been able to support them, I did not give a speech. I did not talk about sacrifice or victory or the lessons of war. I simply stood at a podium at the center of the garden and read names. All 2.3 million of them. One by one. Voice steady, unhurried. Giving each name the time it deserved, the space to be heard, the acknowledgement that this had been a person, not a number. It took 11 days. I read George Palmer's name on the 3rd day, and I thought of his daughter, who was now studying at a music conservatory on Earth, playing piano for audiences who would never know that her father's last words had been about wishing he could come home to hear her play. I read Grace Bennett's name on the 7th day. My voice cracked. It was the first time since Elysium that the cold thing in my chest loosened enough to let anything through, and what came through was not anger or fury, or the mechanical purpose that had driven me for 14 months. It was grief, plain and simple and human. I stood there with her name hanging in the air, and my eyes closed and I let it come, just for a moment. Then I opened my eyes and read the next name, and the next, and the next, until all 2.3 million had been spoken aloud and returned to the wind and the sunlight and the growing things. Catherine found me afterward, sitting alone at the edge of the garden, as the sun set and the sky turned its 7 colors, the same 7 it had turned before the Dominion came, and the same 7 it would turn long after all of us were gone. She sat beside me on the ground and said nothing. She did not need to say anything. She simply took my hand, and we sat together and watched the light change, And for the first time in longer than I could remember, the silence felt like peace instead of absence. "23 formerly subjugated species established independent governments, some for the first time in thousands of years. Trade routes reopened along corridors that had been contested battlegrounds for centuries. Diplomatic channels were re-established between civilizations that had not communicated in generations. The framework that Vielen and I had constructed took shape, imperfect and complicated, and requiring constant adjustment, held together by mutual interest and mutual caution, and the shared understanding that the galaxy had come very close to something none of them wanted to experience again. And for the first time in over 1,000 years, nobody was shooting at anyone. We were feared. We were the species that had ended an empire in 14 months and then, at the moment of total victory, had chosen mercy over destruction, which confused the galaxy more than the military victory had. Nobody was quite sure what we would do next. The truth was, neither were we. We had been so focused on the war, so consumed by the singular purpose that had driven every decision for over a year, that when the purpose was fulfilled, many of us did not know what to do with the silence that replaced it. Edward Shaw retired from the fleet and moved to a quiet colony world where the only sound was wind through tall grass. He built furniture by hand, working in wood with tools that did not need electricity, and he taught local children how to fish in streams that had never known pollution. He never spoke about the war, not once, not to anyone. Helen Cross took a position at the newly established Galactic Intelligence Cooperative, where she designed early warning systems and threat detection protocols intended to ensure that no civilization, human or otherwise, would ever be caught unprepared the way Elysium had been. She worked 16-hour days and told me it helped her sleep. I did not ask what happened on the nights it did not help. Peter Langley disappeared into the classified world, so completely that I sometimes wondered if he had existed at all. He sent me one message a year, on the anniversary of the Dominion's surrender, and it always said the same thing. Still watching, Lucy Harmon wrote a book about First Contact that became the most widely translated work in galactic history, read by species that had never heard a human voice, and translated into languages that had no word for Earth. She donated the proceeds to the New Elysium Reconstruction Fund, and never did a single interview about the war. Philip Morton returned to his laboratory and began designing things that had nothing to do with destruction. Irrigation systems for drought-stricken colony worlds, medical devices for field hospitals on frontier settlements, environmental restoration tools for ecosystems damaged by centuries of Dominion exploitation. He told me, standing in a workshop filled with blueprints and coffee cups and the quiet hum of machines doing gentle work, that he never wanted to build anything that could hurt someone ever again. I told him I understood. I meant it more than I had ever meant anything. I visited New Elysium 6 months after the memorial ceremony. The rebuilt colony stood on the far side of the planet from the garden, separated by a mountain range that blocked the view of what had been lost. A new settlement rising from clean ground, where the fire had not reached. It was smaller than the original, just a few thousand people so far, pioneers and volunteers and families who had chosen to build something new on a world that carried the weight of what had been taken from it. But it was growing, new buildings going up every week, simple structures with small touches that spoke of intention, window boxes with flowers, painted doors, a mural on the side of the community center depicting a sunrise over green hills that looked like Elysium as it had been before. New families arrived on every transport. New trees were planted along streets that did not have names yet, saplings held upright with stakes and string, bending in the wind but holding. I walked through the new market on a quiet afternoon, and the air smelled like bread baking somewhere nearby, and someone was laughing around a corner I could not see, and musicians were playing a melody I did not recognize, and for a moment, the echo was so strong, the overlap between this place and the memory of that other market on that other evening, that I had to stop walking and close my eyes and press my hand against my chest and remember to breathe. When I opened them, a girl was standing in front of me. She was maybe 8 or 9 years old, dark hair cut short, a serious expression that seemed older than her face, eyes that watched me with a steadiness that most adults I had commanded did not possess. She was wearing a coat slightly too large for her. The sleeves rolled at the cuffs, and she held a book under one arm. She asked me if I was Commander Cole. I said I was. She asked me if it was true that the war was over. I said yes, it was over. She studied my face for a moment, the way someone evaluates a promise before accepting it, looking for the cracks, testing the weight. Then she asked, "Are the aliens going to be friendly now?" I knelt down so I was level with her eyes. I looked at her, and I did not lie. Not this time, not ever again. I said, "We are going to make sure of it." She considered that. Not the way a child dismisses something, but the way a person who has already learned that promises can break, decides whether this particular promise is worth believing. Then she nodded, once. A single deliberate nod, apparently satisfied, and turned and walked away with her book under her arm, and her oversized coat flapping in the breeze. I watched her go, and something in my chest shifted. Not the cold thing. That had been melting for months, receding like ice in a slow spring, leaving behind something raw and tender and new. What I felt was warmer, softer, something that felt like the first green shoot pushing through burned ground, reaching for light, because that is what living things do, regardless of what has happened to the soil beneath them. I resigned my commission the following week. I had carried the weight long enough. There comes a point where you have to set it down, or it becomes part of you permanently, woven into your bones and your way of seeing the world. And I did not want that. I did not want to be the weapon anymore. I wanted to find out if the man who had existed before the weapon was needed was still somewhere inside me. I moved to a small house on the coast of an ocean, on a quiet world that nobody had ever fought over. A world so unremarkable that it had never attracted the attention of any empire or alliance. The waves came in soft and steady, and the air tasted like salt and growing things. I started writing. Not reports, not strategies, not threat assessments or contingency plans. I wrote down everything that had happened, from the day the Concorde arrived in our sky, to the day I knelt in front of a girl in a market and made a promise I intended to keep for the rest of my life. I wrote it because the story deserved to exist somewhere other than inside my head, and because the people who lived it deserved to have someone remember it the way it actually happened. On my last day in uniform, sitting at the desk I had occupied for years, in an office that still smelled like cold coffee and classified documents, I made one final log entry. I addressed it to whoever might find it, human or alien, a year from now or 1,000 years from now. I sat there for a long time and thought about Violin's warning on that ship full of starlight, Kaelith's fascination with our history of fighting ourselves, George Palmer's steady voice saying he was sorry he could not come home, the sound of 2.3 million voices going to static, the cold thing that had held me upright through 14 months of war, and the warm thing, fragile and uncertain, that had slowly replaced it. Then I typed 6 sentences. We did not want this fight. We did not start it. We offered friendship, and we were answered with fire. So we answered back in the only language that was left. We have not forgotten how to fight. We have simply chosen to stop. Do not make us choose again. I closed the file. I set my rank insignia on the desk. I walked out into the sunlight and breathed the clean air of a world at peace. I felt the warmth of the sun on my face, and I tried to remember what it felt like to be just a man, standing under an open sky, with nowhere to be, and nothing left to fight. It felt like coming home.